Welcome to the original Gangsters Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Burnstein. I have two very special guests, Novi Toko, former Detroit mobster. Nice to join us, Novi. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Scott. Good
and retired federal prosecutor, Rick Convertino. Rick, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Scott.
And we're just going to really quickly address a bombshell that dropped in Chicago this week. And it appears that the FBI in 2025 in Chicago has come to the conclusion that the trigger man in the iconic Sam Giancana assassination, which took place in June of 1975, almost 50 years ago, was none other than Tony Accardo, the godfather of the Chicago Mafia for almost a half century. According to this new investigation by NBC in Chicago, NBC 5, working in coordination with the FBI in Chicago and getting a bunch of unearthed documents that hadn't been out there before. It's coming out now that the belief is that Tony Accardo, who at that time was in his 70s, put two in the back of Sam Giancana's head in the basement of his Oak Park, Illinois residence, a couple days before he was supposed to take the stand in the church committee hearings, which was Senate hearings related to CIA involvement in the Cold War. It's one of the most infamous unsolved murders in Mafia history. And this just seems very unique, I guess, that you would have someone of that level of esteem, Tony Accardo, in the 1970s, well past the days of him being a hitman back in the 20s and 30s, would be the trigger man on the Sam Giancana hit. Do you guys have any thoughts on it?
When you're going to do something that serious, you have to have for a man who's probably very suspicious at the time. These are assumptions on my part, and an old timer like Tony Accardo would let him in. And then that would be John doing. That's the way things have worked. A person a person that you don't suspect, or even if you did suspect, you would let him in anyway. And that's how it's done.
So I think that what's interesting, or there's a lot of things interesting about this, but it always had been theorized based on just like what Novi just said. It always had been theorized that somebody that was very close to Sam Giancana was the trigger man. Sam Giancana, at the time of his murder, it was about 11 o'clock at night, and he was cooking a midnight snack, supposedly for the person that had come and visited him. He was shot while he was over a stove cooking sausages and peppers. And for the last 50 years, let's say until recently, and the idea that Accardo could have been the trigger man was proffered a couple years ago by the son of a Chicago hitman. And at the time, honestly, I don't think a lot of people gave it much credence. Now, NBC in Chicago and the FBI are saying this is what happened. So I think the belief before was that it was someone close to him, but I don't think anybody ever would have assumed or thought it would have been Accardo. The belief was that it was either Butch Blassie, who was his driver. Tony Spilatro, who everybody knows from the movie Casino, was out in Las Vegas, but was a guy that had come up under Giancana and was known as a hitman. Or Chucky English, who was another enforcer for Giancana. So those were always the three top suspects. We found out recently from this investigation that Blassie and Chucky English were with Giancana that evening. So Giancana had just gotten home from a heart surgery in Houston. He had been out of the country for 10 years, had fled 1966, but had come back in either late 74 or early 75, and then had gone to get his health condition dealt with in Houston, had come back, was going to testify at the church committee hearings in the coming week. And I guess, according to this new information, Butch Blassie and Chucky English had come that evening at about 8 or 9 o'clock, or let's say 7 or 8 o'clock, to welcome Giancana home. And they had some drinks, and they wanted to see how he was doing. And at the same time, Chicago Police Department's OC squad has the house under surveillance. Blassie and Inglesi, Chucky English was Chucky Inglesi, leave Giancana's residence at about 10 o'clock. The killer arrived at about 11. And what's interesting is that the surveillance unit that was outside the house left when Butch Blassie and Chucky English left. And then based on this new investigation, it appears that the FBI surveillance log, the FBI was, as Chicago PD is surveilling Giancana in Oak Park, Illinois, the FBI has a surveillance unit up on Accardo in River Forest. And the NBC Chicago got their hands on the log, the surveillance log from that evening. And it shows Accardo leaving in a car at his home at about 10:30 and returning at about 11:45. And then the gun, I guess, that was used in the case was found almost at like the exact midpoint between Giancana's Oak Park house and Accardo's River Forest house. From Rick, from your perspective, I mean, to have a godfather, at that point, he'd been in power for 35 years as a Don. To use him as a hitman in this, like, what does that tell you?
Well, it's not as extraordinary as it might otherwise be to the uninitiated. I mean, once a hitman, always a hitman. I mean, if you're doing, this thing of ours is more important than anything else. And if that's the mission, if that's what's called for, then I certainly can see him stepping up and doing it. I think Novi's absolutely right. I think in the scheme of things, there's probably only one or two people that could have pulled that off at that time, given the surveillance, given the skepticism of Giancana. So I do believe that I think Novi's right. I think that's exactly what happened, and he was invited into the home unsuspectedly, as probably. He was the only one who could be invited into the home at that point.
And it also makes sense. I mean, I want to ask you guys, you guys are Sicilian, I'm Jewish. But I've heard from people when I've been talking about this recently that it's kind of it's a tradition, maybe the sausage and peppers for a late night snack.
It's not a bad way to die. Cooking up sausage and peppers.
I wouldn't mind going that way either. But I'll tell you the truth, the fact that he's preparing the peppers for a guest makes that scenario more plausible.
And for somebody that was his boss.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. It makes it more plausible because for his driver, he'd offer him a glass of wine or get a glass of anisette or limoncello for the other. He's not going to make sausage and peppers.
At 11 o'clock at night.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it looks like, according to the autopsy, and I don't know if this had been known before or not, but there were two in the back of the head and he dropped. And then they unloaded the clip into his face, or Accardo, I guess, unloaded the clip into his face. The FBI, I guess, believes that it was some message, like, we shot you in the mouth. Like, you were about to talk. So we didn't just blow your head away, we blew your mouth away. It was pretty brutal. It wasn't just the two in the back of the head and left. But does that kind of speak as like a message? I mean, we've heard about message murders before and canaries left in people's mouths or money shoved into orifices or whatnot.
Yeah, it's old school, huh, Novi?
Yeah, that does.
That's old.
I've heard of a message, but we spoke about this before. The last message I heard of that meant something was a pig.
Right, a pig, and that was in
with
Detroit.
His throat slit.
Yeah, it was left on an extortion victim that wasn't paying up. They dropped the pig on his bar's front porch of his bar.
Yeah, that's a hell of a
It was
message.
also that he was a rat.
Right, and he was
Yeah.
Squealers die.
But Accardo
Squealers die.
got his nickname, and I'm going to tie this into a piece of information that came out. Got his nickname Joe Batters, or as Tony called him the Big Tuna because he liked to fish, but they also, people that were close to him called him Joe Batters or JB. And that was a nickname that came from Al Capone. I guess because when Accardo was a enforcer for Capone, he had a reputation of beating people with baseball bats. And Capone nicknamed him Joe Batters. And according to some new FBI documents that have come out, a confidential informant told the FBI that a high-ranking member of the Chicago mob said to him, in relation to Accardo being the trigger man on the Giancana hit, JB, referring to Accardo as JB or Joe, JB might be 75, but he can still put in work. Meaning, like, pull the trigger.
Yeah.
I agree.
And they were like, the old
I'm over 75, and it don't take a whole lot to pull a trigger.
The old timer was kind of saying to this younger Chicago guy, like, this guy talking about Accardo, like, he might be in his 70s, but he ain't anyone that you need to trifle with.
Right. Right. There's plenty of people like that still out there. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hey, just as a popular social media viewpoint, I mean, can you imagine John Gotti in his, at the end of his life being unable to do that? No, certainly. So,
and then we also know 3 years later, Accardo wasn't necessarily pulling the trigger. 3 years later, Accardo's house is burglarized. These cowboy burglary crew that was working for the outfit knocked over this Jewish mob associates jewelry store. They had never cleared it. The guy was a close friend of Tony Accardo's. Accardo says, you got to give it all back. Like, you never cleared this score with us. The guys kind of refused to give it all back. The stuff they did give back, they wait for Accardo to go to California for Christmas and break into the house, take back the stuff that they had given Accardo, burglarize the house, and then over the next year, I think it was 10 bodies, 10 or 11 bodies of guys that were involved in that. And it was the wrath of Tony Accardo. So this was around the same time period. So he might have been in his 70s, but he wasn't somebody that was fearful, I guess, of getting violent when he had to.
Yeah.
But it's just, I guess, just the optics on it. You hear about these guys and you hear about a lot of these guys, the legacies of, I mean, even Tony Giancana, like you heard about him doing stuff in the 40s. And this would be like if you heard that, Tony Jack pulled a trigger on a hit in 1998 or 1996. It's like, yes, these guys have that reputation and they have all these bodies from back when they were kids, but you don't normally think of like a Carlo Gambino or an Angelo Bruno or Raymond Patriarca, the very esteemed dons. Later in their life, you don't think about them pulling triggers. And in fact, I guess this would be the next thing I throw out to you guys. I guess in some ways it's counterintuitive because a boss should be insulated. And as a boss, you've kind of earned the right to not have to do the dirty work. The dirty work's being done by people a lot lower than you. So that makes it an outlier of a situation. But it also, I think, speaks to the fact that once a killer, always a killer. But does the fact that like there was no buffers here. I mean, this was going right to the source. Maybe the two most legendary Chicago mobsters, not named Al Capone, who killed a lot of people together as old men. One killed the other. I guess to make it more of a analogy about us in Detroit, this would really be like if the Jack Tocco, Tony Zerilli beef reached the point where Jack Tocco, as an 80-year-old man, called Tony Zerilli to some type of meeting and put two in the back of his head as an 80-year-old man.
Well, those two were going at it in their much later physically.
Right. No, I know that.
Yeah. So
I'm just saying if I heard that would be surprising to me. Like
it was surprising to you, I'm sure. Right.
Right.
So but in this case is, to Novi's point, how many people would have the opportunity to do that at that point in time?
Opportunity means motive.
Right.
And
ability.
And the ability.
Yeah.
That you've got 4 ingredients there.
Do you think there's any way that your grandfather would have known about that? Because Joseph really at that time was alive, and he was a
what
contemporary.
Year are you talking
75,
about?
June of 75.
No, I don't believe he knew about it. The reason being is my grandfather died in 78?
77. End of 77.
77. My grandfather was incapacitated with dementia for at least 2 years prior to that. For at least 2 years. It may have been more. We worried about it constantly. His children and grandchildren. And no, he would not have known about it.
Because everybody, when it comes to the Jimmy Hoffa case here in Detroit, I mean, there was always, or there still is always the question about who signed off, who greenlit it, how many people had to come to a consensus for that big of a hit. And I would say, these hits happened within the same 6 weeks. Hoffa's killed on July 30th, 75. Giancana's killed on June 19th. So it was in the same 5-6 week period. And they are just, you're talking about huge targets. Hoffa, and in this case, Giancana. Yeah. And this is all speculation. But would you think, and I'm just thinking aloud here, would we think that something like killing Giancana, just like killing Hoffa, I would guess that there would have to be, it wouldn't be a decision made autonomously necessarily. It had to be maybe a group of people deciding that he had to go. You're saying no?
I don't think so.
I don't either.
But within the family confines, it would
in Chicago. You're saying because it was Chicago,
it would be a decision done autonomously.
I agree.
It's in-house house cleaning.
And I also think there was some, and sometimes when into this world, it all comes down to money, right? I think there was, in addition to the pending testimony against the church committee, and there was no indication at that time, just to be clear, that Giancana had cut a deal or anything. He was being called in front of the hearing the same way all those guys were called in front of Kefauver or McClellan. He very well could have gone in there and just pled 5. So there was no discussion that he had ratted. But they were worried enough to kill him before he jumped on the stand.
2 people can keep a secret if one is dead.
Right. There was animosities that had built up, I think, from when Giancana left in 66, and he comes back 10 years later. He'd made a lot of money overseas, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Mexico, and he wasn't sharing any of it. And I don't think he thought that he had to share any of it. He basically said, I'm not the boss anymore. You kind of deposed me because I was there was too much of a fervor over my being a boss. People remember this was the Rat Pack and JFK and Sinatra, and people were kind of upset that, I think some people were upset that Giancana was being so much bravado and so many headlines. So he was of the opinion, I left town, I'm no longer the boss, and what's mine is mine. And Accardo and the rest of the Chicago guys said, well, you might not be the boss anymore. We might have kicked you off the throne, but what's yours is actually ours too. That kind of fits with the way things operate in that way?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, typically that's the general rule of thumb.
Yes. I mean, Giancana would have made all that money if he didn't have the reputation he had.
You're saying he would not have?
No, he would not have.
So
there might have been some astute real estate investments, but making money in all these different venues, reputation calls for a lot of that, and with that reputation, you got to kick back.
And it would have been the same in Detroit. If some guy would have left Detroit and went and lived overseas for 10 years and then came back to Detroit and he had made all this money, you're saying Jack Tocco, your grandfather, whoever would have been like, give us our cut of it.
Yeah. If you had made your reputation based on things you did that involved your reputation that was earned in Detroit. Now, if somebody went to Tucson and bought up Paradise Valley in 1920, they wouldn't make any claim to that. Not the outfit here.
You know, you were calling in Gamtax that Giancarlo Cantanucci had put a runway in an airport in Tampa, $70 million, I think it was. Went down, bid on it, did it on its own, put it in, and Jack Tocco had a sit down with him. I think it was Jack and Ton, and they said, "Hey, congratulations, you did a great job. We're happy for you. That was because of us. That was us that put you in there. You know, that's why you're going to kick back some." You recall that in the
No, I don't recall. No, I never. I don't remember that at all.
That was part of the testimony.
But that part of the problem with Giancarlo is he didn't like to.
Right. For people that aren't aware, we're talking about a big Detroit federal racketeering case against the Detroit Mafia that Novi was a part of. And part of that case was an extortion against a construction company owner named, what was his real name?
Cantanucci.
Joe Cantanucci, or John Cantanucci, whose company was called Giancarlo. And the Detroit LCN was constantly trying to get their hooks into to Giancarlo.
Yeah. Well, we went over this once before, I believe, in one of the other podcasts, is that when you're doing business in Michigan and you're expected to help out the other Italian guys in legitimate business, you're expected to help out. You don't want to, you're not going to make friends. And John Catanacci never had the reputation of ever distributing some of the wealth. And I'm not talking about giving up money. I'm talking about making a contract available to an Italian contractor rather than a Polish contractor or somebody else.
Last question I want to put to Rick Convertino, who, this is more of a general question when it comes to the federal government. And obviously this is going to be just kind of conjecture on his part. But in a year period of time when that church committee was convening, you had three very powerful OC figures assassinated. You had Giancana, you had Jimmy Hoffa, and then you had Johnny Rosselli, who was another Chicago mob guy that worked for Capone and went out to the West Coast. They were all being called in front of the church committee. None of them actually, I think, made it in front of the church committee. What's your opinion or your take on the FBI, the CIA dealing with the mob kind of under the table back in the day to kind of for the greater good of America? You know, in the World War II, it was Lucky Luciano. They kind of allowed him to go live overseas as long as he helped the U.S. in World War II. In this case, it was fighting the Cold War against Russia, against Cuba. There seemed to be an unsaid alliance.
You know, Thucydides said in the history of the Peloponnesian War, he who has the power does that which they have the power to do. He who is weak accepts that which they must accept. So if you have a threat, it doesn't have to be a real threat, a perceived threat of something that, to quote a popular movie, is bigger than U.S. Steel. Right. There is nothing that's going to come in the way of that. And if that takes a bullet here or there, then that's what's going to be done. I mean, there is absolutely no way that it would be acceptable to a potential threat to testify before a committee like the church committee. So, I mean, it's pretty much as simple as that.
But I'm also talking about just the fact that at face value, looking at it on its surface, the mob and the federal government are at odds. They're fighting a war against each other.
Sometimes.
So it's for people that again study this stuff, or you kind of scratch beneath the surface and you learn that maybe on the surface they were at odds, but in a lot of situations throughout American history, not a lot, but a couple of situations throughout American history in the 20th century, they were working together.
Yeah.
What you just said, who did you quote?
Thucydides.
There's an old Italian Sicilian proverb that Now I know where it came from. That quote, those with power will do. And I can remember my father telling me that. And my dad was big on those things. And what he just said, it sounds like it came from that quote.
Yeah. It's the history of the Peloponnesian War.
Well, thank you guys for joining me and giving me your expert analysis on this breaking news out of Chicago. I guess Tony Accardo, you can add another part to his legacy. The guy was already quite the legend, and we didn't really know about this. And now, according to NBC in Chicago, Chuck Gowdy, shout out to Chuck, and I guess the FBI as well is kind of co-signing this. They had the head of the FBI in Chicago on the 2-part series discussing it. And he says that the Giancana case is an open investigation, even though they have acknowledged that the trigger man was Accardo, and Accardo's been dead since 92. I guess the implication from the FBI in the interview with NBC Chicago is that they believe there are people involved in the conspiracy that are still alive. It seems a little unrealistic that they'll ever bring a case, but that's what was said in the reporting. So, but thank you guys for giving me your perspective. Rick Convertino, we're going to have him back for a lot more content. So look forward to that in the rest of this spring and summer. And then Novi Toko, you can come to Original Gangsters members only Patreon and see Novi and I at least 2 hours a week minimum. And then, possibly more as the year goes on. We're going to be bringing on more people onto there to tell their exclusive stories and get away from some of the toxicity that is in the YouTube world. So thank you guys. Thanks, for
Scott.
being behind the glass. Scott Burnstein for Rick Convertino and Novi Toko. I'm out.